Krishnena sa Mahatmana Rishashar Pakcharakshita Durachayebhyo Mechubhya Durachayebhyo Mechubhya Krishnena sa Mahatmana. Please chant. Tavagnir Vata Vashakcha Risha Sarpakcha Rakshita Durajebhyo Mechubhya Krishnena sa Mahatmana. Tavagnir Vata Vashakcha Risha Sarpakcha Rakshita Durajabhyo Mechubhya Krishnena sa Mahatmana. Tavagnir Vata Vashakcha Risha Sarpakcha Rakshita Durajayebhyo Mechubhya Krishnena sa Mahatmana. Thank you. The fire. Also, from mortal dangers. Krishnena, by Krishna, Su Mahatmana, the very great soul. And the translation for text 20 is as follows, by the disciples. Forest fire, the wind and rain, the bull and serpent demons, from all such insurmountable, deadly dangers, by that very great soul, Krishna. And then text 21. Smaratam Krishna Viryani Lila Panga Nirikshitam. Sorry, my computer changed something. Hastam Basitam Ranga Sarvanas Stitlaha Kriya. And the translation for text 21. As we remember the wonderful deeds Krishna performed, his playful sidelong glances, his smiles, and his words, O Uddhava, we forget all our material engagements. Om Jnana-timirandasya Gananjana Shlakaya Chakshurin Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manopistam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam. Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Guru Vaishnavam Sha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Ragutam Vitam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakha Vitam Sha. Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavan Ishvari Rishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpa Taribhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Eva Cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnebhyo Namo Namaha. Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimati Romapada Swami Iti Namine. Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swami Iti Namine. Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Sunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. I'll read the translation for text 20 again. We were saved from the forest fire, the wind and rain, the bull and serpent demons, from all such insurmountable deadly dangers by that very great soul, Krishna. There's a conversation between Uddhava and Krishna in which Krishna is explaining the difference between the conditioned souls and the liberated souls. And Krishna says, these are his words, a liberated soul, although living within the material body, sees himself distinct from the body, just as one who wakes up from a dream sees that it was not his real life. An ignorant person, however, thinks the body to be the self, just as the dreaming person takes what he sees to be his reality. And this is from Uddhava Gita, text 8. So in this particular, these two verses that we're looking at today, it's Nanda addressing Uddhava. So I'm drawing from Uddhava himself having had a conversation with Krishna. And commentary by Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur has him saying something very similar. So his words, a person who has awakened to Krishna consciousness no longer identifies with his gross and subtle material body, nor does he become affected by the happiness and distress of material life. So this is in contrast with the person who hasn't and is afflicted, one could say, with innumerable problems. This topic was interesting. It came to me today, these verses, and I have contact with one person who's now in India, and the connection with this person is merely an appreciation of the deities. And I don't speak to the person. There's just, all I do is regularly send 3 pictures of the deities once a week. And recently there was some back and forth conversation, and the person just outlined one problem after another. And I just, mirrored what the person was saying so the person could hear some objective view. I'm not giving advice because I generally think it's not sensible to give advice. It's much better for a person to have reflected what they're thinking by somebody else, that they can come to their own understanding. And at the end, all that was necessary was to say, I understand, I'm glad that you understand that you actually have some resource to help you through this, because after all, where Krishna is present, there's always victory. And then it was like everything changed. So the minute one actually reminds somebody that all those problems that exist in material life, it's almost a dreamlike state, because the reality is that when Krishna is present, one can really see things much more clearly and be objective. So it's just because persons come to identify with their gross and subtle material bodies that, all these incredible problems seem to exist. So adding to this understanding is Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, who states that those who are sleeping in the lap of material nature, they cannot realize the illusory nature of their existence until they awaken by means of self-realization. So it's a very subtle thing to start to perceive reality on a different plane. It's no longer, if one is identifying with the body, then naturally anything that's infringing on the subtle body seems to be immense and huge and insurmountable. But if one is actually taken to turning one's attention to looking towards realizing the self as the soul and the connection with Krishna, then that material struggle, problem, it can be viewed in a much more detached manner. So in the current text, Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur gives a commentary on Nanda Maharaj's words, and he conveys how the processing of Nanda Maharaj is happening in his subtle body, his mind and emotions. And also, he does the same thing with Uddhava. He's able to convey the subtle, what can one say? The subtle emotions and thought processes happening in Uddhava too. So, Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he comments that Uddhava is saying to Nanda Maharaj, so this is subtly, one can't perceive this, but the subtle emotions and the subtle thought process. So Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he has that ability to enter into the heart of the particular devotee and understand the thinking. So he gives this as being the thought of Uddhava to Nanda Maharaj. But you will not die. You will live a long time raising your son with affection. So he's pinpointing what is the actual emotional concern present in the mind of Nanda Maharaj. And in fact, in the previous verse, he was responding to a thought of Nanda Maharaj who had been asking his question. Nanda Maharaj's question had been, will Govinda not come just once to see how our family members who are suffering in the blazing fire of separation are about to die either today or tomorrow? So that had been Nanda Maharaj's question. So naturally, there's a question that comes. If Nanda Maharaj is fully awakened in self-realization, then is he seeing himself and his family members as about to die very imminently from feelings of separation? Is he identifying with his subtle body in some sense? Because we've just heard Uddhava saying to him, you're not going to die. So then, one wonders, because basically the idea is that when you're identifying with the subtle body and the gross, or beginning with the gross body and identifying with the gross body and the subtle body, then in actual fact, everything seems enormous, an enormous problem. So, that question comes. Is Nanda Maharaj perhaps identifying with his subtle body? So this naturally calls for an examination of the subtle body in the process of realizing oneself as the spiritual being within the body. So the distinguishing characteristic of one who's considered a conditioned soul is that he's identifying with his body. Thus, for example, one may be experiencing mental distress because perhaps one's spouse is dissatisfied with the living arrangement, and one feels obliged, oneself may feel obliged to accept that living arrangement due to it having been made by family members. So the distinguishing characteristic of one whose consciousness has become elevated through realization of the self as spirit soul is that the mind is in a very settled state. So this is the distinguishing characteristic. And Krishna explains this state of mind as being established in sameness and equanimity. Those are his words. So in fact, It's a stage in the process of realizing the self, of having this mind, having one's mind have this quality of uniformity, meaning that the mind does not behave how it normally behaves, because the normal activity of the mind is just accepting something, rejecting something, and moving backwards and forwards constantly. But in a very advanced stage, or moving along in the process of realizing the self as spirit soul, the mind comes to this position of being very uniform. So that's a distinguishing characteristic of somebody who's become elevated through a realization of the self. The mind is very uniform. So and these are Krishna's words from Bhagavad Gita 5:20. He says, those whose minds are established in sameness and equanimity have already conquered the conditions of birth and death. They are flawless like Brahman, and thus they are already situated in Brahman. So, and the Sanskrit for that is Ihava tar jita sargo yesham samye sthitam manaha nirdosham hi samam brahma tasmat brahmani te sthitaha. So by Krishna's statement that persons liberated from material life of identifying with the subtle body, they're in fact no longer subject to take birth in the material world, but can enter the spiritual sky after death. And Srila Baladev Vijayabhusan's explanation, he says that Brahman, or identical Brahman spirit, is identical with the Lord, and he is devoid of attachment and repulsion. And it is because persons are convinced of this equality of Brahman, or the Lord being spiritual, due to his absence of desire and hatred, that they become situated in Brahman. So one has to come to that point of understanding that the Lord is actually free from attachment and hatred, because that's the nature of the mind. It generally dislikes somebody, really likes somebody else, rejects somebody, is very attached to somebody else. But if one comes to the understanding that the Lord, being spiritual, is not on this plane of attachment or hatred, then oneself is able to come to such a state of this sameness of mind. Even while in this world. And Srila Prabhupada puts it this way: the Lord is flawless because he's without attraction or hatred. That's what makes him flawless. So persons whose minds are absorbed in this quality of impartiality, or the faultlessness of the Lord, have in fact conquered birth. So this may seem like, when we're practicing Krishna consciousness, we hear, it sounds like a very simple idea, there's not going to be repeated birth. And one hears one isn't one's body, but it's good to look at it a little bit more closely. So the distinguishing characteristic is coming to this equanimity of mind. Now, the situation would be quite different if one were looking at somebody who hadn't accepted this, and these are Srila Prabhupada's words, the proper treatment to detach the mind from material functioning. So you actually had to treat the mind, like in our American culture, when the mind is very disturbed or the emotions are very disturbed, generally persons think, I may need therapy. So hence an arrangement is made where persons can speak to a therapist, express their emotions, or speak something of how their mind is functioning, and the therapist will make some diagnosis, and then depending on the methodology that's used, if it's American behaviorism, then there'll be an attempt to give some cognitive therapy so that existing thoughts are replaced with more positive thoughts. If they're negative thoughts, they're replaced with positive thoughts. But actually, from Srila Prabhupada, if one's looking from the spiritual perspective, there's a proper treatment for the mind, and that is to detach the mind from material functioning. That's actually the proper treatment for the mind. So mental control is necessary if one's going to practice any yoga. And as Srila Prabhupada puts it, one must control the mind by engaging in the transcendental service of the Lord. So that's the means to control the mind. That's the means to overcome this fluctuation that goes on in the mind, the fluctuation in the emotions. And that's from purport in Bhagavad Gita 6:36, that Srila Prabhupada discusses this proper treatment of the mind. Now, I have a background of studying Western philosophy. So there's a philosopher, Kierkegaard, who speaks about despair. And in this first statement, one might think, Nanda, because that was the question I'm raising, is Nanda Maharaj perhaps subtly identifying with his subtle body? Because he's actually speaking about, and Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti gives the subtle thought that he's actually concerned that they're all going to die because their attachment to Krishna is so strong and they're separated from him. So this Western philosopher, Kierkegaard, he speaks about despair, and it's interesting. This is, Western philosophical thinking. He says the despairer understands that it's a weakness to take the earthly so much to heart. So somebody who's despairing, even a person with very materialistic consciousness, they're going to understand that even them taking despair so seriously, it's a weakness. They'll understand that. So Kierkegaard, he continues that instead of, these are his words, and it's very interesting, instead of veering sharply away from despair to faith, humbling himself before God for his weakness, he is more deeply absorbed in despair and despairs over his weakness. So you understand, it's this identifying with the body, and this is a Western philosopher putting it into words. One is feeling despair, but at the same time one understands that actually just despairing is a weakness. So even a person who's not practicing Krishna consciousness, a Western philosopher, is able to see that there's the reflection, and that's the functioning of the soul. The soul is reflecting, the fact that I'm identifying with this despair, it's a weakness. So, and there's, in fact, this book is studied, if one is studying Western philosophy, where Kierkegaard is expressing these ideas. It's a book called Fear and Trembling. It's a very interesting title. Anyway, in this particular case, Nanda Maharaj's despair is expressed in a very logical fashion. And this is the very interesting thing you find with all the highly realized personalities in Bhagavatam. They speak in a very logical, calm manner, even if the inside is turbulent. And he is expressing what Kierkegaard has referred to as a deep faith. And Nanda Maharaj is not ascribing importance to something material or earthly, as would be the terminology of Kierkegaard. And Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he says, or rather, that was his particular commentary earlier on, that Nanda, you're not going to be dying. He's very practical. And this is Nanda Maharaj's response. So again, it's Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur getting into the subtle functioning of Nanda Maharaj. And this is Nanda Maharaj speaking. Unlike before, we will not be saved from the hands of death. So it sounds like despair. And Nanda Maharaj continued, Krishna saved us from the forest fire and Indra's torrential rains. Because of his natural affection, and that terminology was Samahatma, Mahasneha, Maya. But why is he not saving us now from the terrible fire of separation? I cannot understand this. So this is the question that Nanda Maharaj is asking. And it's the reason for what appears to be despair on his part. So there's, going back to the examples that he's using of when Krishna did save them, we find that the mood of the cowherd boys, there's that same deep faith in Krishna at the time of a forest fire attacking them on all sides. So Srila Sukadev Goswami, he makes a comparison, saying that the boys became, at that time, there's a fire on all sides. The boys became fearful and approached Krishna and Balaram, just as those who are disturbed by fear of death approach the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So the boys express this faith, and these are their words, and you can hear the faith. O Krishna, Krishna, most powerful one, O Rama, you whose prowess never fails, please save your devotees who are about to be burned by this forest fire and have come to take shelter of you. Shri Kishori Ki Jai. And the cowherd boys, they further state this very advanced stage of self-realization. And listen to their words. You can glean the very advanced state of self-realization. Krishna, certainly your own friends shouldn't be destroyed. O knower of the nature of all things, we've accepted you as our Lord, and we are souls surrendered unto you. So you can hear, even in a moment of great danger, the mind has that equanimity. They're actually able to reason. They say, you know the nature of all things, and we've accepted you as our Lord, and we're souls that are surrendered to you. So certainly we as your friends shouldn't be destroyed. It's very logical. Even in that moment, there's fire all around. So you can see the mind is very steady. And also there's this very sublime relationship between Krishna and his devotees, that is free actually of any material despair. And is seen in Krishna's response to the cowherd boys. He says, just close your eyes and do not be afraid. And their response, all right. This is with fire all around. And they immediately close their eyes. So Ananda Maharaj's analysis, when he's speaking about this incident, he says, out of natural affection, that's how that exchange was able to happen. You know, Krishna says, just close your eyes. All right, close their eyes. There's natural affection, and what deep faith. So you see the advanced stage of self-realization. And then it's the statement in Srimad Bhagavatam in the 19th chapter where this incident is described. It says, Krishna, the master of all mystic perfection, opened his mouth and swallowed the terrible forest fire, saving his friends from danger. So that's all that was required from Krishna's side. He opened his mouth and this huge raging fire just got swallowed by him. Extraordinary. Now, in a similar manner, When ordered by Indra, who was angry that a sacrifice that was supposed to be for him had been stopped by Krishna, all the dangerous Samvartika clouds were summoned by Indra, and they appeared above Vrindavan and began to pour water incessantly with all their strength and power. These clouds are the same clouds that are usually summoned at the time of devastation. So out of his anger, he summoned these huge clouds. There was constant lightning and thunder, blowing of severe wind, and incessant falling of rain. The rain seemed to fall like piercing, sharp arrows. By pouring water as thick as pillars, the clouds gradually filled all the lands in Vrindavan with water, and there was no visible distinction between higher and lower land. So I've read that little section, it's from Srila Prabhupada. And to tremble from the severe cold. Unable to find any other source of deliverance, they all approached Govinda to take shelter of his lotus feet. And at that time, all the inhabitants of Vrindavan began to pray, and these are their words. Dear Krishna, you are all-powerful, and you are very affectionate to your devotees. Now please protect us, who have been harassed by angry Indra. Notice again, equanimity of mind. Very simple statement. And you can see, it's not actually, everything's flooding around. The rain is coming down like pillars. It's become so cold, you're so soaked, the body's shaking. But this is how the words come out. It would not be. It would be quite a different thing. What emotions, how our emotions may be expressed through not being in such an advanced stage of self-realization. But in their case, very simple. Now please protect us who have been harassed by angry Indra. And the response of Krishna is, again, in this situation, I shall give protection to my pure devotees in Vrindavan who are at present completely dependent on my mercy. You know, we hear calm, cool, and collected. And in this kind of situation. And then what happens? Krishna immediately, again, mystic power. So, Nanda Maharaj, however, is despairing. And this is what we're reading, and that's why I'm examining all of this, looking at this subtle despairing of being saved from the fire of separation. So I described an actual fire, an actual torrential downpour, and the kind of response. But here Nanda Maharaj, he's actually concerned about being saved from this feeling of separation from Krishna, because he's experiencing it as an internal fire. And Srila Vishwanath has Uddhava responding to Nanda Maharaj. And Uddhava says to Nanda Maharaj, just remembering Krishna's moon-like face produces an intoxicating nectar that removes all kinds of distress. So this kind of worship of Krishna through remembering him, because that's what Uddhava is saying to Nanda Maharaj, just remembering Krishna's moon-like face, it's so intoxicating that any kind of distress will immediately disappear. So this kind of worship that one's remembering Krishna, and if one's in this very advanced stage of perfection in devotion in one's worship of Krishna, in a mood of being separated from him, it's actually called Vipralamba. So Lord Chaitanya, and today is the appearance of Lord Chaitanya, and somehow these verses came and they just epitomize one of the 8 teachings of Lord Chaitanya. And Lord Chaitanya, he describes this being in this very advanced stage of self-realization, realizing oneself as a soul in relation to Krishna, in this mood of being separated from him. And he describes this mood as follows. And remember, Uddhava had said that just if you remember Krishna's moon-like face, it produces an intoxicating nectar that removes all kinds of distress. So here's Lord Chaitanya's description of having a mood of separation. And I'm going to read the Sanskrit first. Yugaitam nimishena chakshusha pravrishaitam sunjaitam jagatsarvam govinda virahena me. And here's the translation. My Lord Govinda, because of separation from you, I consider even a moment a great millennium. Tears flow from my eyes like torrents of rain, and I see the entire world as void. So those are Lord Chaitanya's words from Shikshastika, the 7th verse. Lord Chaitanya only wrote 8 verses. This is the 7th one of those 8. And so he's saying, in his agitation, a day never ends, because for every moment it seems like a millennium. And pouring incessant tears, he's saying, my eyes are like clouds in the rainy season. The 3 worlds have become void because of separation from Govinda. I feel as if I were burning alive in a slow fire. So notice, the eyes are pouring torrents of tears, but internally there's a feeling of burning up, a slow fire. That's how Lord Chaitanya describes it. And that's also what Nanda Maharaj says. He calls it a fire of separation. And Lord Chaitanya says the same thing. It's like actually burning up in a slow fire. And Nanda Maharaj, he has a response to Uddhava when Uddhava tells him, just if you remember Krishna's moon-like face, it's so intoxicating that it's going to remove any distress. This is what Nanda Maharaj responds. And this is coming from Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, who's again able to access the very subtle thinking of devotees, and he's accessing the subtle thinking of Nanda Maharaj. And this is Nanda Maharaj's thinking. He says, this is true, but even though recollection of Krishna removes all suffering, now, because of our ill fortune, that remembrance creates more suffering. Whenever we remember Krishna, we lose all interest in material activities. He says, Nas sithila kriyaha. Only by the force of habit do we continue to bathe, eat, drink, and perform other daily activities. In such a state, we cannot remain alive. So that's Nanda's response, Nanda Maharaj's response to Uddhava. That actually it's just habit that they're going through the motions of eating, drinking, resting. But in actual fact, they've lost all interest in material activities. So I thought just to end with a very nice insight into something of the very advanced stage of self-realization and how it manifests for a very elevated, extraordinary devotee like Nanda Maharaj. And he has a parental mood in his devotion to Krishna. And he's obviously in a very perfected stage in his process of self-realization. So he's worrying about the late arrival of his little son. So this is backtracking. He's not separated, so I'm just backtracking because these are some of the things he remembers. So Nanda Maharaj would remain on the roof where there was a little shed, and then one could get like a bird's eye view of all the surrounding land. So he would stand in that very elevated spot on the roof by the shed until he could indicate to his wife that he was seeing Krishna surrounded by his little cowherd friends, and they were coming back with the calves. And then he would address his wife. My dear Yasoda, just look at your offspring Krishna. See his blackish bodily luster, his eyes tinged with red color, his broad chest, and his nice golden necklace. How wonderful he looks, and how he is increasing my transcendental bliss more and more. So, this is an attempt to look at these two verses, and somehow the mood of Nanda Maharaj epitomizes Lord Chaitanya's teaching of coming to this point of being separated, having this mood of serving Krishna, but in a mood of separation. So if there's any thought on this subject matter, please feel free.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
All right, cool. Thank you, Master for your class. Please forgive me for not organizing my thoughts, but thank you for your class. And this particular class, I kind of like to stick to the theme of the fire analogy, because you were making a point that simply by engaging in devotional service, we could control our mind, I believe. You made many points. I can't remember all of them, but we hear that our first prayers of the day is Samsara Davanala, forest fire, and then Lord Chaitanya, his first verse is Chaito Dharpana Marjana Bhava Mahadavagni. We're all suffering this forest fire of material existence. And this just is appreciation of Savar. Maybe you can elaborate on this. I don't know if I have a question, but basically there's a couple of verses related to this fire analogy that I really appreciated from the Bhagavatam. And we see that Hiranyakashipu, for example, or like you gave the analogy of Indra with the resonance in Vrindavan, they kind of viewed the, like Indra viewed the resonance in Vrindavan, Lord Krishna, 7-year-old Krishna, as an uncontrolled fire that needs to be extinguished. So I'm going to take these pillars of, water and extinguish Krishna and extinguish the same with Hiranyakashipu. He saw Prahlad as a forest fire that needs to be extinguished. And so in our devotional life, sometimes we may see devotees as destructive forest fires who needs to be extinguished by any means, whatever means we may do that to ruin their reputation, etc. But maybe you could elaborate on this analogy. It's a beautiful analogy that I heard first in the purport, and then there's actually a verse in the Bhagavatam. So it compares devotees to fire, fire. And it basically says if we come close to fire, it can help us. If we come too close to fire, it can hurt us. In much the same way, if we respect the Vaishnavas, they can help us. But if we become too familiar with them, not that they hurt us, but Krishna doesn't tolerate. So this one devotee in his purport to the 11th canto, chapter 7, verse 45. I'll just read these couple of verses and maybe you can elaborate on them. He says, 11.745, Prabhupada's disciples' commentary. He says, to carelessly approach a Krishna-conscious personality is just like carelessly approaching fire, which immediately burns if not handled properly. The Lord does not excuse mistreatment of a pure devotee. And so there's actually a verse on the Bhagavatam related to this from 11th canto, chapter 26, and verse 31. It says, just as cold, fear, and darkness are eradicated for one who has approached the sacrificial fire, so dullness, fear, and ignorance are destroyed from one engaged in serving the devotees of the Lord. So I really appreciate. So my question, if I had the question, is how do we know whether an external situation is actually uncontrolled forest fire, persons, places, things, and circumstances? Or how do we know whether it's a controlled fire? Or how do we know whether or not it's not them, it's us? How do we distinguish that? Because sometimes Hiranyakashipu, the demigods, prayed to the Lord Narasimha, Hiranyakashipu is an uncontrolled fight. He needs to be extinguished. So how do we know whether something needs to be extinguished in our life or not, and without making that offense or?
Well, I mean, the analogy here, or not analogy, but the the mood of serving Krishna in separation was compared to a fire, but the fire that, in your looking up those verses from the 11th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, was just pointing out that the pure devotee, who's a representative of Krishna, is fire-like, and one should be very cautious when approaching a pure devotee. So a little different in terms of the emphasis and, the concept of fire and how it's used, because there is more like a comparative use of fire. So your question coming to asking in one's own dealings, actually thinking that one has to kind of extinguish another person. So there is generally, in persons that have come to devotional life, there comes to be a natural enthusiasm, that utsaha, and a natural concomitant happiness that's there from performing service. So now for somebody else standing on the side who may be forgetting that there's this enthusiasm within, this fiery enthusiasm within, and that is actually a spiritual quality in that person, could then make a mistake and start to see from a material point of view. So as long as one doesn't slip in one's understanding that a person is, by coming to take up the process of self-realization, is actually carrying spiritual enthusiasm, as long as one doesn't slip up and forget that, then one is safe. It's only if one actually then starts to apply one's own subtle body functioning that one isn't free of, and imposes it on somebody, that then there comes to be a problem. Because generally one is imposing one's own subtle body that one is still subject to and still identifying with on somebody else, because generally, until the process of self-realization allows one to be able to see that's how the functioning of one's own subtle body. So if one is actually not seeing it yet, one will be putting it out and imposing it on others. So that's just a thought in response to your question.
Yeah, actually, I was just gonna say my question was related to the first verse today, not the separation, the fire separation from Krishna, because today's verse says it compares the wind, the fire, the bull to demons, and so that was kind of related to my question, the demons. So you answered it pretty much, but could I ask one more thing, if that's okay?
Yes, there's always time for
Purnima.
Jai Baladev, there's always time for 2 questions. Go ahead.
So my second question is that since it's Gaura Purnima, you want to take advantage of it. A lot of times as practicing devotees, we hear it's kind of the same related. Honor the devotees, honor the Vaishnavas, etc. But there's that famous verse, I think it's 11:247. Archayam eva haraye, pujam yashadaye hate, natapa deshu chanyeshu, sa bhakta prakriti shmitaha. It says, even if you worship the deities, but if you don't show proper respect to the devotees, or the people in general, that person is considered a prakrita bhakta, materialistic devotee is considered the lowest of all. So we see that it's, in one sense, it's much easier to show respect to our guru, and we might even show more respect to devotees than ordinary people who are, let's say, eating meat. Just like we had this Zoom meeting, and I heard, sometimes there was like criticism, like they're eating meat, this and that. But we see that even news anchors, when they unnecessarily criticize people out of pride from some sexism, some racism, they may get fired from their job. So, so my question is that how can we keep ourselves? I mean, it's kind of a question that I kind of bring up all the time, but I think it's the most important point. What are some steps we could make us realize that actually, if we don't respect everyone, it's actually detrimental to our Krishna consciousness? Because it's like pouring water on fire and igniting the fire and pouring water on it again. You can't have two. If you want to ignite the fire in Krishna consciousness, in a good way, using this fire analogy, but you can't keep pouring water on it. So it seems that offering respect to the guru, but this verse says disrespecting devotees or even people.
Concerned with looking at the issue of respect and how that plays itself out in devotional life, and also in relation perhaps to persons that aren't practicing devotional life. So, like for instance, let's say you brought up the example of a Zoom meeting. So there's a situation where the devotional community is interacting in a public forum with the members of the broader Rogers Park community. So you mentioned some of the devotees expressed some of their concerns, and the concerns were, if there's now going to be a building that's going to be jammed up right against the temple, the big issue is going to be that some persons may have their grilling equipment ready, or even their kitchens may be right here, and so suddenly there's going to be wafting into the temple some of the preparations that they may be making, and it may be of a fleshy nature. So in that particular situation, one could say that there has to be an awareness of the audience that one is addressing. So if one has practices as a devotee, certainly one understands, one's going to find that very unpleasant, but one has to consider the audience. And if the broader members of society in the Rogers Park area are on a whole meat eaters, then that wouldn't be a very intelligent or necessarily even respectful thing to say. That would be an objection to having a building right next door to the temple. It actually is not good judgment. It would be much better to hone in on an issue that the broader community can relate to. So that's a comment on, how do you know what to do and what not to do? So And it has to do with respect. If you want to show respect, you have to be aware of what is important to somebody. A devotional community interacting with a broader community, the intelligent thing, respectful thing, is to know the habits of the broader community and think the broader community may not have the same habits. So not raising the issue of the eating habits. Yeah, so that's a thought. And then the other one of dealing with respect in the devotional community, it's a very similar one to the first point you brought up. One has to remind one's own mind that actually somebody who is serving Krishna in some way is carrying a spiritual sentiment of devotion for Krishna. So that is immediately, the criterion is met for needing respect. Immediately. And if one is struggling with respect because one's mind is seeing something externally as objectionable, behaviors, habits, one has to pull one's mind back from that. Certainly, unless one is in a position that one actually is obliged to help the person in a particular way, one should rather direct one's concern to somebody who is in that position so that it can be handled in a delicate, thoughtful, respectful manner. Because if one is not in that position, there's bound some disrespect may emerge. So again, always take the safe position. Consider what's the right channel. So there's two thoughts in response to your question. So thank you, everybody, very much for your kind attention on this very wonderful day of Lord Chaitanya's appearance day.